Have you had a good moan this morning? Had a grump about the weather? Have you been complaining about the government, complaining about your work, complaining about any number of things? Moaning is part of the national psyche in Britain. It's part of being British, and I don't think it's the best part of being British. If so, then I think we're going to have to do some homework this morning, because there are three main topics, I think, in the Bible passage we've just looked at. There's contentment, there's generosity, and there's dependence. And it begins with the school of contentment. And the title of this study is Enrolling in the School of Contentment. I think that's a wonderful title, and you know straight away that I didn't invent it. I stole it from another preacher. When Paul planted the church in Philippi, they were sort of difficult days in some aspects, but the church began in a house of one of my favourite Bible characters, a well-off lady called Lydia. And the church grew and prospered and went very well. And then the Apostle Paul headed south. By the time he'd reached Thessalonica, the church he'd left back in Philippi was doing very well indeed. And they sent him a few gifts while he was in Thessalonica. Now, Thessalonica's 75 miles away from Philippi, and so somebody had to walk 75 miles each way, here to Aberystwyth, to take a gift to somebody. That's a long way to take a gift to someone, no matter how much you like them. And now they'd caught up with him again. There's some doubt about where Paul was when he was writing this letter to the Philippians, but wherever it was, they'd sent a man called Epaphroditus to bring their gift to him. Epaphroditus was a pastor, a preacher, one of Paul's team, and it would seem, from what little we know of him in Scripture, a wonderful man of God. Now Paul has to write back and say thank you. It's got to be a thank you letter for every gift, isn't there? And he says, well, thank you. Not that I need the gift, because I have learnt to be thankful. I have learnt to be content in all circumstances. But it's still lovely to hear from you, he says. Content in all circumstances. Now that's easy to be content when things are going well. When things are not going well, that's when we begin to let things get on top of us and we moan and we complain. And that's when God has to get through to us. That's why I said there's homework with today's study. The homework is to learn to be content in all circumstances. The Apostle Paul had a difficult life. Sometimes he went hungry. Sometimes he went thirsty. Sometimes his life was in danger. Sometimes he was ill. And yet sometimes he had plenty. And there was enough for some steak sandwiches and some strawberries and cream or whatever. And he could have a good time. But he says he's learnt to be content in all circumstances. And when things were difficult, were hard, Paul took it as an opportunity to learn to be content in constrained circumstances. Now, I don't think I would stay or have stayed a pastor for very long in my life if whenever a church member lost their job, was given their P45 and hasta la vista, and they were tearful and worried about the future, I as pastor breezed through the door and said, "Isn't this wonderful? You've just been given the opportunity to learn to be content with less." Now, it might be true, But I wouldn't have said it because I would have caused offence and probably undermined my role and my trust as pastor. But it's true. When things are tough, when circumstances are not what we want, we're being given an opportunity to find God in that circumstance and learn to be content. It's like being at school. We have to think about it. You have to take time thinking about it. We have to work on it. And it's good to be well off. But when you get a job and when we exit those constrained circumstances, do you know what? We actually have to learn how to be content with more. Because some people are not. Some people, if they begin to earn more, suddenly become voracious in their desire to earn even more, or overprotective of what they've got, or crazily spending what they got and don't appreciate and enjoy the comfort that being in good, prosperous circumstances brings. So when things are turned around, we often have to learn to be content again. As a matter of fact, we have to enroll in the school of contentment many times during our life. And as we get older, we have to learn to live with the constraints and the demands of getting older and our bodies aging. And as a friend said to me, old age is not for wimps. We've got to learn to be content even when things are not going well. The school of contentment. And whenever I think on this subject, whenever I read this passage, I'm reminded of a couple whom I love dearly. They're two of the loveliest people upon this planet. I visited their house, how long ago was that? Maybe 30 odd years ago, 35 years ago, when they were quite young Christians. A couple of years before, she'd walked down the aisle one Sunday morning on Easter Sunday and committed her life to Jesus, and a few weeks later her husband followed suit. And several members of their family had since then become Christians, and they had the most beautiful house in one of the most desirable places in the UK. Big sweep of a drive leading up to it, detached, gorgeous garden, classy house. It was nice. And sitting in front of it was a Range Rover. And they were lovely, they were generous, they were living well, they were prosperous, and they were serving God in their local church. They're having a great time. And we visited them several decades later. Gone was the big detached house, gone was the Range Rover. Now they were living in a small end of terrace house, nice one, but small end of terrace house with a cheap popular car parked on the drive in front of the garage next to it. He had been self-employed and he had invested a lot of his money into a pension fund, and in the crash of the big bank crash 10 years ago, the pension company went bankrupt and he lost his pension. And we visited them, and not once did they complain. Not once did they moan about the money they'd lost, or the pension fund, or the managers of the pension fund. Their whole conversation was, what a lovely, pretty little house we live in. What a gorgeous town we live in. And they do live in a gorgeous town. Oh, we've got a great church around the corner. We've got a lovely minister. And they just counted their blessings. They had learned to be content in constrained circumstances. And they were as happy then as they'd been at the height of their prosperity. I have learned to be content in all circumstances, says the Apostle Paul. Then he praises the Philippians for their generosity. There's no contentment without generosity. We were not put on earth to be rich, and we were not put on earth to be poor. We were put on earth to be generous. The most generous people Susan and I ever worked with were landless people in Brazil. They lived miles from the nearest town, and yet every Sunday they would walk to church. Some of them walked 5, 6, 7 miles to church carrying their children. And we had a wonderful time together on Sundays, singing praises, and inevitably food would appear and people would donate food and there'd be food. One of my abiding memories is our little 18-month son sitting on the lap of one of the ladies of the church as she stuffed rice and beans with plenty of garlic into his mouth like a little baby chick in its nest. And we always came away with gifts in the car of pawpaws or melons or once a live chicken, whatever. You couldn't stop giving. And although they were poor, they were some of the happiest people I've ever known. And they never went desperately needy. Help always arrived if they're in constrained circumstances. They had learnt to be generous. Winston Churchill, and it's not often I quote him, Winston Churchill said, "You make a living by what you get, you make a life by what you give." And so it's our generosity that marks our Christian character. Generosity is the thermometer of our spiritual life. It's the thermometer of our church life. It's the test of our character. It's the number 1 on the list of our appraisals. Our generosity tells what's going on between us and God. Learn to be content goes hand in hand with generosity, and the Philippians were very generous. And finally, there's dependence. I think if the Apostle Paul were to be a film star, he wouldn't be George Clooney. He'd be grumpy old Rambo, I think, going around the world, not killing people, but preaching at people, always in danger, dangerous man to be around, always, you never knew where he'd be going next, going off in all kinds of directions. And yet, Paul had learnt to be dependent. It hadn't come easy. It had gone against the grain for him to have to rely on gifts. But he received gifts and he had to learn to respond to them with grace, with a graceful and thankful heart. He was not an independent. Independence is not a virtue in the Bible. Dependence on God and dependence on each other is. Working together, sharing with each other, giving and giving to each other is very much part of being a Christian. In Penrach, the church I pastored before I retired, when we dived into the church archives, we found that over 100 years before, when the church was new, it was in financial difficulty. In fact, it was facing a lawsuit for payment of a debt, and there was dispute about whether they owed the debt or whatever, and they didn't have any money. They were in real danger as a church of going under. And their mother church, the Welsh Baptist Church in town, that had originally planted the English-speaking Baptist Church, 100 years before, they'd come up with money and paid off the church's debt. And that had gone kind of forgotten until we went through the church records and discovered how generous the church down the road had been to us 100 years before. So when the church down the road celebrated its 150th anniversary, our church got together and we clubbed together and we bought them a new kitchen. And in a sense, the generosity of 100 years before had been repaid 100 years later, but it was paid with joy. And what a privilege, what fun it was to give them a new kitchen. Dependence, generosity, contentment. These are marks of a great Christian. And this is what you and I are going to have to work on. This is our homework this week, to be content in our circumstances. Charles Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher, said there are no crown bearers in heaven who have not been cross bearers on earth. I have learnt, says Paul, to be content in all circumstances.